One of the definitions of youth is that you think death and decay is something that happens to other people, but one part of you thinks, funnily enough, in my case, it's not going to happen. Although you're intellectually persuaded that it will, a bit of you goes on saying, well, it's just a rumor as far as I'm concerned. But around about 40, the jig is up, and you have to join in with the great communality of those who are going to die.
Well, listeners, February has rolled around pretty quickly, hasn't it? It's an absolute honour, frankly, to be joined for this episode by the winner of the 2025 Booker Prize for his sixth novel, Flesh, David Szalay. David, you're joining us, it seems, from Slovenia, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm in Slovenia.
You have described yourself as a European writer, first and foremost. You've travelled a great deal throughout your life. Born in Montreal to a Jewish family, your mother a Canadian, your father Hungarian. You've lived in Lebanon, London, Oxford, Brussels, and Hungary. And now you live, most of the time, when you're not in Slovenia, in Vienna. When it comes to living in Vienna, I know the city fairly well. Before we started recording, I said I had an uncle who lives there. Does Vienna help you write? Does it hinder you in any way?
I've only lived there for a couple of years. Flesh was finished before I moved there, actually. I wrote Flesh in Hungary, where I lived before Vienna. So I haven't really written much since I've lived in Vienna. So I guess the answer to the question has to be no. It doesn't seem it doesn't seem to be very helpful, but maybe that will change. I hope so.
Well, no doubt we'll be talking a lot about London, not least because the novel that you've chosen to speak about by Martin Amis is, of course, The Information, one of the big three London novels. For those who may not be familiar with your work, the first of your novels was London and the South East, published in 2008. Other titles include The Innocent, published in 2009, Spring, 2011, All That Man Is, a personal favourite of mine, 2016, and then with Turbulence, 2018, and most recently, Flesh. You are now 52 years old as a writer. I bring up your age because, of course, this is an important theme of The Information, and I wonder whether that has anything to do with the choice. That's for you to tell me. You were born just a year after Amis's first novel, The Rachel Papers, was published. When did you first discover Amis's work?
I think London Fields was actually the first book of his that sort of crossed my path. I think my father bought a copy of London Fields when it was first published in 1990, something like that.
Around 1989, I think.
Yeah, 1989. And my father, it turns out, hated it, but it was sort of lying around the house, and I just looked through it initially out of pure curiosity, I think. I hadn't really, I have to say that my recollection is that it's not like Martin Amis was a sort of name that I even knew at that point. I was 15 or something, and I guess a more bookish 15-year-old. I was a bookish 15-year-old, but the wrong type of bookish 15-year-old, maybe. So it wasn't like I kind of came to that book with much of an idea of who this person was, but I remember being enthralled by the prose, by the Baroque extravagance of the prose, and by specifically, I guess, the way it depicted what was then contemporary London in a sort of very concrete, albeit sort of slightly exaggerated for comic effect way. It was one of my first experiences, I think, of really seeing, enjoying, being electrified by the way that sort of language can collide with the contemporary world, can interact with the contemporary world and create something very exciting. And it was quite a big moment in a way for me as a sort of embryonic writer, I suppose. Funnily enough, I don't think at that point that I didn't sort of sit down and read the whole book from beginning to end. My memory is at that point that I just sort of read bits of it. I kind of would read a few pages here, a few pages there, sort of savoring them, enjoying them, laughing at them perhaps. But it was only later that I sat down and read the whole book systematically, as it were.
And when you did finally sit down to read the book fully, what did it leave you feeling?
I still think today that London Fields I find it almost too sort of bleak, willfully bleak somehow. It's not my favorite of his books. It's not the book that I've chosen to talk about primarily today. So yeah, I think maybe it was maybe the sort of the real sort of slightly willed despair, or what I would found in it, a kind of almost sort of willed despair, wasn't something that I particularly clicked with me. But the language and as I say, the way that the language embodied and depicted, the contemporary world, contemporary London very specifically, which was where I lived at the time, was thrilling for me.
The first guest of this year, Rob Doyle, chose London Fields to speak about. You have chosen The Information. Why The Information?
I think The Information is fairly obviously a writer's novel. It's about writers, the sort of pitiless view it takes of what a writer's life is like and what a writer's kind of soul is like, if you like, is both extremely funny and very accurate, I think. And so that's certainly part of it. I think it's a book that really plays to what I regard as Amos's strengths. I think he's at his best when he's funny. His style, for me, works best with comedy, with out-and-out comedy. And I think beyond that, it works best with comedy that has a kind of self-deprecating aspect to it. Probably, my favorite of his books always have this kind of strongly self-deprecating aspect. The Rachel Papers, if I'd had to choose my next favorite, that would probably be it. And I think, but like in The Information, it has this kind of self-deprecating, the sort of the savagery, the savage comedy you feel is turned against himself to some extent. And I think that sort of somehow, for the way he writes, that really helps, because I think in some cases that he can seem, and maybe London Fields, what I said about London Fields has this quality that there's a savagery, a kind of hardness, coldness, which can come across as slightly heartless in some contexts. But when it's turned against, when it has this self-deprecating quality, when it's his own vanity, which you feel is being punctured, I find that that's where he really sort of hits a sweet spot, and they kind of, everything comes together for me in his work when that's the case. So that I think is very much the case in The Information. He said that both of the principal characters are versions of himself, but he's pitiless to both of them. Both of them are kind of absolutely awful in many ways, at the same time as being extended a kind of sympathy by the author. And that is something which also I think is a feature of my own work. This mixture of the characters being sort of quite awful, but also being rendered in some sense sympathetic by the treatment that they're given by the author.
The only other guest to have chosen The Information, the writer John Niven, said that he has been both Richard Tull and Gwyn Barry throughout his career at various stages. He knows what it's like to be the minnow and the marlin in the literary pond. What does the writer in you feel about these two characters? You've said that there's a feature of depicting characters in the way that Amos does in this novel in your own work, but of course Amos is pointing the finger at himself. Can you relate to these two characters? Absolutely.
I mean, I think that every writer, can relate to particularly Richard Tull, because every writer starts off as Richard Tull, really. I mean, the kind of struggling writer, the aspirational writer, the writer whose kind of ambitions exceed their achievements, both in terms of the success of the work in their own eyes and in the world. I think all writers have been there, and he writes about that brilliantly. He writes kind of movingly about the sort of frustration and the struggle and the crushing feelings that can be involved there. But he also writes about the intrinsic vanity of this. Richard Tull is a kind of is just as vain a character as Barry. It's not like one is more vain than the other. And I in the same way that he sort of, Barry's work is obviously sort of held in contempt by Richard Tull, and you kind of feel by Martin Amis too. Richard Tull's work is clearly pretentious garbage, the way it's depicted. So it's not like it's very important in the novel. The whole novel wouldn't work at all if Richard Tull was actually a brilliant writer. It works far, far better that he, as it were, deserves his obscurity because his writing is difficult, pretentious, and dull, which is certainly how it seems to be depicted.
Rob Doyle said to me that he found the information to be rather a difficult read as a writer. Again, you mentioned the fact that London Fields came across as excessively bleak to you, but from a writer's perspective, he also felt very much the bleakness, the dark soul of the writer kind of boring into his own as he read it, and perhaps a confrontation with the mirror. But I think that the same goes for you and probably many writers who have read this book. Comic though it is, it's a satire on the psychology of a writer that perhaps only fellow writers can truly access or understand.
Yeah. No. I mean, and obviously the kind of the way the rivalry plays out through sort of chess and snooker and tennis is brilliant and very, very funny. And the sort of exactly the kind of the way that the sort of egos, the particularly male egos of these two characters are so engaged and invested in this competition of who's the better writer and who's the more successful writer is brutal the way it's depicted. It's unsparing. But, I have no doubt that it contains more than a grain of truth. And I actually found it a kind of cathartic read as a writer. I didn't find it depressing at all. And I mean, I read it some years ago before I was in any way what you might describe as a successful writer, really. I mean, I was far more Richard Tull than Gwyn Barry at the time when I first read this book. I mean, I probably still am, but certainly then I definitely was. And that didn't impair my pleasure in it at all. On the contrary, I think, as I say, it was quite a cathartic experience.
I'm glad you mentioned tennis and its metaphor for rivalry and a proxy for violence between men. You use it in Flesh.
Yeah.
And when I read that passage, I thought, we surely have to bring up the overlap. Did you consciously write tennis into Flesh, acknowledging to yourself that this was a recurring theme in Amos's work?
I don't think I did it consciously, but it's undoubtedly, and obviously, as you say, tennis recurs, again and again in Amos's work as a metaphor for rivalry, as you say, as a sort of proxy for violence. And I think it's highly likely that unconsciously that steered me towards the tennis bit in Flesh for sure. As you say, it's the tennis thing in Amos is huge.
Well, then let's have your first reading to give those who, to their shame, have not yet read the information, the first reason to pick it up and start reading.
Sure, yeah. I'm going to have to put on my glasses to do this. So this reading is from quite far through the book. I picked it because it's sort of, it's just, it's about the vanity of the writer. And this paragraph, it's sort of half-page paragraph or 2/3 of the page. It just seemed to really express that vanity in a really concentrated way. In the past, Richard had often been known to be difficult. Difficult was a word that applied to his person as well as his prose. Unfortunately, though, he soon failed to command much of an arena to be difficult in. There was surely no more elbow room for difficulty. Difficulty was exhausted, he decided, after his yodeling stalk out from the debating hall of the Whetstone Public Library Literary Association, whither the novel. He stalked out because he was the only panel member who, in the cafeteria before the talk, had not been offered a biscuit with his tea. As he rode alone on the bus and later on the tube train with his armpits ablaze, Richard recalled that he had, in fact, been offered a biscuit, but not a chocolate one, just a ginger nut. And that same year, he had to be expensively dissuaded from suing a reviewer of Dreams Don't Mean Anything for that dismissive filler in the oldie. Richard considered being difficult now and stalking out of bold agenda. Then what? A few plangent inhalations on Avenue B? Like all writers, Richard wanted to live in some hut on some crag somewhere, every couple of years folding a page into a bottle and dropping it limply into the spume. Like all writers, Richard wanted and expected the reverence due, say, to the warrior Christ an hour before Armageddon.
All of these things that the writer wants, are they what the writer wants?
I mean, that thing about the warrior Christ an hour before Armageddon is one of those things that made me laugh out loud. I mean, it's so grandiose. It's sort of cosmically grandiose. It expresses the kind of absurd vanity by which a writer might hope to have cosmic significance. And that is exaggerated, but that's Amos's method. And it touches something true. I think all writers kind of hunger for some form of greatness, and I think that puts its finger on it in a very, very amusing way.
I think the closest that Amos ever came to aping the warrior Christ an hour before Armageddon was perhaps in his descriptions of 9/11 in the second plane.
Yeah, I mean, I find his sort of later work where the sort of comedy somewhat drops away and a sense of sort of grappling with great themes comes to the fore in a sort of relatively humorless way. I just don't think that works for me as well as his earlier phase of his work, which maybe ends with The Information. Maybe The Information is the last novel of that period of his career. And I think, this is almost paradoxically, he kind of has more profundity in the comic work of the earlier phase of his career than in some of his later novels, where you feel that I feel anyway, that he's almost sort of straining for profundity. I mean, one of the other things in The Information, which when I first read it made me laugh out loud, was the name of the prize, the Profundity Requital. It's just such a kind of perfect encapsulation of the vanity of writers and also the absurdity of prizes.
I wonder on that note, David, whether talking about The Information, revisiting it in the wake of a great triumph of your own, is helping you to process that. Perhaps that's just the sort of medicine that a writer needs when they've just won the Booker.
No, that's definitely the case. I mean, obviously, I've reread this book in preparation for this chat, and yes, I mean, his kind of merciless and persistent attack on the absurd vanity involved in all of this is very, very kind of bracing and healthy for someone who's just won a major prize. I mean, definitely, it's good for the soul.
Amos found himself boxed in by critics for a variety of reasons throughout his career, one of which was his focus on, and you surely knew this was coming, David, masculinity. Do you suspect or even worry that you might bear that cross these days?
I mean, I think, yeah. I mean, I think I mean, first of all, I don't know why masculinity would be a kind of off-limits subject. I mean, I think that why should Amos, for instance, if that's something that he is interested in and wants to write about, why shouldn't he? I certainly don't have a problem with that. I mean, I do, in my own work, I somewhat resist. I certainly don't want to be pigeonholed as a sort of writer about masculinity. And I would assume that Amos, neither did Amos. And I mean, his writing is certainly not exclusively about masculinity at all. But yeah, I mean, it's something which I don't want to be pigeonholed in. And so I always push back against the suggestion that sort of Flesh, for instance, is predominantly or primarily about masculinity. I accept that it's about masculinity in some way and to some extent, but I would reject the idea that that was its primary theme, and that's the sort of main point about it. And so now I wouldn't want to be the masculinity writer at all, no.
I'm assuming that you've never set out to, that it just sort of shook out like that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think as a man, as a male writer, writing honestly about male experience, trying to be as truthful about it as you can be, I think you're inevitably going to, first of all, end up writing to some extent about masculinity. How could you not? And then you're also likely to, there will be uncomfortable things for you, the writer, and for readers, for everybody in what you end up writing. And I think that, one of the reasons that Amos remains such an interesting writer, I would say, is precisely that. Is precisely his refusal to exclude things that might make him or other people uncomfortable.
One great example in the information of Amos writing obscurely uncomfortable areas or facets of masculinity comes in at a point in the novel where Richard Tull is reading to his son. And Amos writes, as quite often happened, Marco's pajamaed presence, his innocent silky writhings, had provided Richard with an erection.
No, I remember this passage. This passage stuck in my mind as well.
This used to cause him disquiet, and struck him as something he had better shut up about. But again, he was enough of an artist to have faith in the universality of his own responses. He asked around among dads and found that it was so. It was general, universal. It still struck him as essentially perverse. When you thought of all the other occasions which cried out for hard-ons that never came, and here you not only didn't need one, you didn't even want one.
No, absolutely. That paragraph, both because of the thing that would have been more comfortable not to write about at all, and secondly, the thing about him being enough of an artist to have, I can't remember the exact words, but faith in the universality of his own responses or whatever. That's extremely important. That's what sort of underlies the validity of writing about things like this. The sense that this isn't some personal defect of your own that you're writing about. This is a general quality of all men, all people, whatever.
In your own life as a writer, David, do you find yourself similarly verifying your experiences with others?
I don't do it systematically, but of course, just through talking to other people, other men, just through normal social interaction and through normal interaction with other, just other people, whatever. You get a sense of this. You get a sense of the fact that this is something that is generally shared, certain things. Obviously, more recently, I've got that sense from the reaction to the books, which has suggested that I'm not writing about things that are, only applicable to myself. But I never thought I was, I always assumed, I kind of work on the assumption, I think, that anything I experience, other people are also experiencing. I really do. That's why I was so struck by the particular wording in that paragraph you read out about Richard being enough of an artist to have faith in the universality or generality of his own experiences. So I was really struck by that rereading the book just a couple of weeks ago, because that seems to me to really put its finger on the very important aspect of what it is to be a writer. It's to have that faith in that generality of experience, so that you then feel that your own experience can be a basis for talking about experience more generally. And, that also, of course, comes into the book, because the book, he talks often in the book about the universal, about the kind of quest that these two writers are engaged in is ultimately to kind of write something universal, write something that transcends themselves. And that's one of the sort of bases on which you might hope to do that.
You said in a recent interview, quote, "I took from them," and this is referring to not just Amos, but John Updike, "the lesson that if you want to be a proper writer, you have to deal with the sordid." What is it then about sordidness that stretches the writer to be their best, do you think?
Yeah, it's because the sordid is uncomfortable. It's almost like it has a parallel with therapy, perhaps. Therapy is not going to be useful if you only talk about things that are comfortable for you. In the same way as a writer, if you're writing a novel, if you just remain in a comfort zone, where you're always certain that the kind of good taste and good judgment and sort of moral kind of bona fides of your person are going to be unimpeached by what you're writing, then you're unlikely to say anything interesting. I think that's the main problem. I think interesting things that are interesting to read tend to come from excursions outside that comfort zone. And as I said before, that's one characteristic of Amos, which means that he continues to be interesting to read, because he was not afraid of doing that.
Gwyn Barry conspicuously swerves anything tangentially linked to sordidness. He is a utopian writer, an insufferable optimist about society. But of course, he knows what people like to read, and so does very well out of it. Do you think Amos was already sensing, when he wrote the information in the mid-90s, the rise of the inoffensive novel, the inoffensive novelist?
I assume, I don't know, but I assume that the inoffensive novelist has always been around. I mean, I think that, I don't think it's a kind of 1990s and after phenomenon, probably. I think, for me, the character of Gwyn Barry and the information is interesting because you certainly don't get the feeling that Gwyn Barry is writing these books, Amelia books, in a sort of cynical spirit of, let's cash in because I know this is what people want. It's much more complex than that, I think. He kind of, on one level, or part of him, believes in what he's saying, but his conduct as an individual shows that another part of him certainly does not prescribe to the kind of values that his books express. So it's that kind of, there's a kind of hypocrisy, obviously, but it's a complex hypocrisy because I think the character seems convinced that he believes in the values that his books are expressing, and so the hypocrisy is he's hiding from himself to some extent what's going on, and I think that's where it really becomes interesting and becomes an interesting depiction of I think it's all too easy as an artist of any sort to kind of fall into a situation like that where you depict life, and I mean this does come back in a way to what we were saying about sordidness, where you depict life even if it's just a little bit nicer or whatever than it really is. It doesn't have to be dramatically different from the reality. It's just kind of the tweaked reality. I often find that people, as depicted in a lot of film, TV, novels, are just a little bit nicer than people are in real life. And that's a kind of quite a thoroughgoing thing there. And I think it has kind of quite profound consequences because the sort of narratives that we consume as TV watchers, novel readers, film viewers do shape our sense of what normal reality is. And so if these stories that we're being told depict reality just ever so slightly, but systematically different from how it really is, that affects us. And it also then affects our response to the real reality, as it were, that we encounter. So yeah, it's quite a big thing. And I think, as I say, that Amos sometimes as a writer goes too far in guarding himself against that, perhaps. Like as I was saying about London Fields, I find London Fields just a bit too kind of willfully bleak about people and about society. I kind of always imagine that Amos is kind of oversteering, as it were, with that, where he's so on his guard against going the other way that he perhaps goes a bit too far in the other direction.
It always interests me that Amos felt that he was both Richard Tull and Gwyn Barry, because he seems to most people like somebody who only ever knew what it was to win at this game.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there's many very, very funny. There's the whole. I mean, he very systematically brings in every conceivable sort of aspect of this. There's the sort of vanity publisher that Richard works part-time for, and there are very kind of so it goes. I mean, there are people kind of sending in their stuff to the vanity publisher that Richard works from. So Richard's looking down on them. He's certainly not kind of at the bottom of the pile, although he's kind of in decline. And then the books that Richard is constantly reviewing. He's always reviewing a biography of some totally obscure and forgotten person. And that is itself a kind of comment on the sort of transience of fame and on kind of, it's a sort of classic sort of memento mori soap bubble type thing. And then even more so. And again, I have some slight reservations about whether this quite works, but the sort of passages where he starts talking about the universe and, obviously his intention there, and it kind of works, is to put an even more brutal perspective on this, so that, everything is completely insignificant. And so that the kind of the conflict and the vanities of these two characters at the center of it are just sort of microscopically insignificant.
But as for passages that you feel really do work, or at least the ones that you've chosen to read today, what do we have in store next?
Yeah, okay. I'll read a passage which contrasts the sort of fates of these two guys, where they're on the plane. They go, in a way, it's kind of one of the climaxes of the book, this joint tour of America that they do. It's very, very funny. Of the pressures facing the successful novelist in the mid-1990s, Richard Tull could not easily speak. He was too busy with the pressures facing the unsuccessful novelist in the mid-1990s. Or the resurgent novelist, let's say, for now. The unproved novelist. Richard sat in coach. His seat was non-aisle, non-window, and above all, non-smoking. It was also non-wide and non-comfortable. Hundreds of yards and hundreds of passengers away, Gwyn Barry, practically horizontal on his crimson barge, shod in prestige stockings and celebrity slippers, assenting with a smile to the coaxing refills of Alpine Creek water and sanguinary Burgundy, with which his various young hostesses strove to enhance his caviar tartlet, his smoked salmon pinwheel and asparagus barquette, his prime filet tornadoes, served on a timbale of tomato and a tapenade of Castilian olives. Gwyn was in first. Richard was in coach, drinking small beer, eating peanuts. And coach was the world, coach world, world traveller. To his immediate left sat someone very young. To his immediate right sat someone very old. And there was Richard, in the middle.
Let's talk about style. Amos's famous dictum, as you know, on style, as inherent to the experience of the novel, style, as he put it, as morality, detailed, configured, intensified. Flesh, like many of your books, doesn't invest an awful lot in style. And you've said this is partly because writers today are having to engage far more distracted readers. Where then does this leave style? Was Amos wrong about style?
No, Amos wasn't wrong about style. I mean, I think he was absolutely right about style. I just think that style is I mean, it's impossible to have a text which doesn't have style. I mean, the Amos's style is at the extreme baroque end of style. It's extremely ornate, extremely rich, extremely baroque. But all texts have style in some sense, in some measure, or of some kind. And I think that what Amos said about style is absolutely true. It's inseparable. It is the text. I mean, the text is the style. It's literally impossible to separate the two in the end. So, I mean, sort of paraphrases and summaries and stuff can never do justice to a thoughtfully and consciously written book, because the style, the actual words that have been chosen to express whatever is being expressed, are inseparable from that content. I mean, they're the same thing.
In terms of his stylistic flair, some guests on this series have isolated a phrase or a sentence, since he was the master of great sentences, that have always stuck with them, or simply reminds them of what he was so good at. Does such a phraselet or sentence exist for you?
There are several from the Rachel papers, actually, which I can kind of immediately call to mind. I mean, if I thought longer, I'd probably think of more. At one point in the Rachel papers, he has like a zit, and he says it's like a double yolker, like an egg with two yolks. And then I think in the Rachel papers, does he at one point think that he's gay and he's looking at sort of magazines of bodybuilders to see if he responds sexually to them? And I think he describes the bodybuilders as tenements of beefcake, which is just an unforgettable image. I haven't forgotten it. I must have read that book, 20 years ago. So absolutely. And I mean, as I say, if I sat and thought about it longer, I could think of many more. He is absolutely amazing at creating these intense, memorable phrases, descriptive phrases, which also, when they're really at their best, when they really work, seem completely fused with the thing they're describing. You know, afterwards, it's impossible to think of the thing without thinking of the words that he has found for the thing. And I think, yeah, that's maybe his greatest talent as a writer is that kind of ability to put words to things in a way which seems so, at once so imaginative and unobvious, and at the same time so inevitable and fusional that it's impossible afterwards ever to sort of separate them in your mind.
Do your other writer connections, friends, associates similarly love this novel?
I have to do some sort of Q&A for somebody coming up where one of the questions is, what book would you recommend for every writer specifically? And for a moment, I sort of paused and thought, oh God, that's a really difficult question. But then I thought I'll probably say this one because I think, yes, it's so medicinal for a writer to read this book. And the fact that it's written by someone of the stature of Amos is important. For this book to work in its cathartic, medicinal way, it has to be written by someone of very great stature. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
It has to be the message from someone who has tasted proper success. Its authenticity as a book comes from that for me, partly. I mean, obviously, that's an extraneous factor, but I think it's a significant one.
Another overlapping theme I think you could spot with The Information and your latest novel, Flesh, is social mobility. This is something that very much preoccupied Amos as well. We see this in the character of Istvan in Flesh, but he's writing all the time about these worlds crossing over, particularly in London, with characters like Szalay. Perhaps this is something else that you sort of find has maybe crept into your own work that was maybe sharpened by reading Amos.
I think so. When I say that my first sort of encounter with Amos was London Fields, and I actually lived in not only London, but in fact the kind of West London environment that he specifically talks about and bases his story in that novel. Yeah, the sort of the idea of the social structures and hierarchies of a city like London, and they're right to the fore there, absolutely. And I think, as you say, it's highly likely that part of my own sort of preoccupation with that and consciousness of it even comes from reading him. Yeah.
Did you ever meet Martin Amos?
I actually did. I've slightly lost touch with him, but I used to be a very good friend of a guy called Orlando Seal, who grew up with Delilah Seal, who, as you must know, is Martin's natural daughter, and who, she and Martin had a relationship, as father and daughter from the time when she was in her mid to late teens. The one time I met Martin was in the context of a family party at the Seals. So I met him, as it were, not as a writer. I mean, I myself was only about 17 or something at the time, so I didn't really say much to him. I was somewhat in awe of him. And the only words I actually exchanged with him, as far as I remember, were he asked me where the loo was, and I said something like, I think it's over there. And then he went off over there. That there aren't any bon mots or anything associated with this meeting, but I did actually meet him on that one occasion, yes.
Short and mundane as your exchange with Martin Amos was, it's more than a lot of people got, and certainly those who count themselves as lifelong fans forever in his debt. I think perhaps we should leave it on one final reading.
Well, I wanted to read something because, it's all too easy to focus with this book on the sort of sufferings of Richard Tull. But one of the brilliant things about it is the way that it success brings some torment to Gwyn Barry as well. And so it's not like there's just a straightforward winner and loser here. And so I wanted to read a passage about the problems of being a successful writer, a very vain one. Okay, this is from later in the book. It's Gwyn and his self-obsession. At 10:30 or thereabouts, Gwyn stepped into his study. The 3 tall windows, the inlaid bookcases, the heavy wealth. His great workstation, mahogany dining tables, French desks, formed a broad arc in the center of the room, slabbed with the thick shapes of processor, printer, copier. Here the two cultures, Gwyn believed, were attractively reconciled. The bright flame of human inquiry, plus lots of gadgets. Give Gwyn a Palatinade smoking jacket as opposed to a pair of tailored jeans and a lumberjack shirt, and he could be Captain Nemo, taking his seat at the futuristic bridge of the sumptuous Nautilus. His morning coffee was there, laid out by Paquita. His morning newsprint was there, laid out by Pamela. All the non-tabloid dailies, 3 weeklies, 1 fortnightly, 2 monthlies, and a quarterly. On the French desk lay an Italian notebook, open on the front page, where Gwyn had written in longhand, The road from Emilio? The road to Emilio? Beyond Emilio? The house was utterly silent, a silence of tiptoe and finger to the lips, like the house of his grandfather who worked all night and slept all day. Gwyn relied on 2 different agencies for his press clippings. His publishers used an agency and they sent him stuff, and he'd made do with that for a while, but he kept coming across extra references to himself over and above what they sent him, and he didn't like that. So now he employed a rival outfit, giving them the broadest possible brief. And still he would encounter stray mentions of his own name, unduplicated in the agency envelopes. Now he sat himself down. In the early days he had confined himself to reviews of his contemporaries, in which the example of Gwyn Barry might reasonably be invoked. Then he branched out, reading reviews of the novels of younger, and indeed older, novelists. Before he knew it, he was reading all fiction reviews. Reviews of Panamanian allegories, Japanese thrillers, reviews of reissues of Don Quixote, Humphrey Clinker. It was the same with literary criticism. Reading all reviews of books about modern writing quickly developed into a habit of reading all reviews about any writing whatever. Poetry, drama, and travel had long since climbed on board. Pliny, Nostradamus, Elizabeth, David, Isaac Walton, Bede. The besetting interest in contemporary fiction extended not only upwards but also sideways. He started reading reviews about contemporary art, and then non-contemporary art, contemporary sociology, architecture, economics, jurisprudence, and then non-contemporary ditto. And then again, it seemed natural enough that reports on contemporary agriculture would eventually contain some light-hearted reference to the pages in Emilio that dealt with, say, crop rotation. And this happened. It came to pass. And from that day forth, Gwyn found himself helplessly committed to agriculture as something to follow, plus hydroponics and so on, all in the same sheet dip and turnip swagging prose.
David, it's been a pleasure. Thank you ever so much.
For me too. Thank you very much, Jack. It's been great. Thanks.